Welcome to Psychological Explorations with Dr. Michael Axelman.
And Daniela Velasquez.
And John Quasarano.
Today we're going to be exploring Winnicott's paper from 1949, Mind and its Relation to Psyche-soma. We'll begin with a review of the paper, talk about some of the key points, and then we'll apply this material to case material and to broader applications to society. Winnicott begins the paper with an exploration of what he refers to as irreducible mental elements. And he introduces the notion of the mind and psyche-soma. And I quote, "One can study the mind of the individual as it specializes out from the psyche part of the psyche-soma." So there's a specializing out from the psyche part. And that's the introduction of the mind as a place of study. He continues, the psyche is not localized in the brain or anywhere in the body. Psyche here, and I quote again, means the imaginative elaboration of somatic parts, feelings, and functions. That is physical aliveness. And I add to that this notion of being that we're going to be exploring as we move forward. Psyche and soma over time develop through interrelating, with psyche informing soma and soma informing the psyche. The imaginative elaboration of the psyche interrelates with somatic sensations and functions. So the young developing infant is filled with all types of tension states associated with digestion, tactile sensations, warmth and cold. And these sensations are informing the psyche. And the psyche is developing some conceptions, imaginative elaborations of these feelings into what are referred to as these internal states. He puts forth this idea of the perfect environment, which is characterized by mild to moderate infant care failure on the part of the primary caretaker. And it's through this adaptation to failure that the baby develops and integrates psyche and soma in a healthy way. In the perfect environment, the relative failures of the mother are adapted to by the infant. Adaptive success made possible by the infant's understanding. Mental functioning of the psyche informed by the body soma. Winnicott is known by this phrase, the true self, and it's something he introduces again in this paper. And I quote, "The true self, a continuity of being." So he is equating the true self with continuity of being. Is in health based on psyche-soma growth. So the true self is being contrasted here with false self as adaptation of the mind. The mind in this theory, it emerges defensively. So we talked about the perfect environment, and he contrasts this environment of infant care with the bad or the tantalizing environment. And I quote again, a bad environment is bad because by failure to adapt, it becomes an impingement to which the psyche-soma, that is the infant, must react. The bad environment is bad by failure to adapt. It becomes an impingement. So the child is faced with an experience of infant care failure that's too great for them to adapt to. And this is what's referred to as impingement. And then the psychosoma, instead of adaptation, goes into reaction. And I quote again, certain kinds of failure on the part of the mother, especially erratic behavior, produce overreactivity of the mental functioning, overgrowth of the mental function, reactive to erratic mothering. We see that there can develop an opposition between the mind and the psyche-soma. In reaction to the abnormal environmental state, the thinking of the individual begins to take over and organize the caring for the psyche-soma. In health, the mind does not usurp the environment's function, but makes possible an understanding and eventually a making use of its relative failures. So the taking over and organizing of caretaking by the mind goes into observation, memorizing, cataloging, looking at the caretaker's states and trying to make predictions about their patterns of erratic behavior. So the mind starts to surveil and try to find patterns. What could have been, through continuity of being, the integration of the psyche and soma now moves into the dominance of the mind and the mind's relationship to the psyche. To explore more deeply this notion of tantalizing, and this is from an early Webster dictionary, teasing or tormenting by presenting to the view some unattainable good. So the bad environment is a tantalizing environment where something is presented, but it's not attainable. More tantalizing parenting leads to states of confusion. A more common result of the lesser degrees of tantalizing infant care in the earliest stages, we find mental functioning becoming a thing of itself, practically replacing the mother and making her unnecessary. Impingements demanding excessive reactions cannot be allowed for. All that can happen apart from confusion is that the reactions can be cataloged. So the mind comes in and takes over what could have been the freedom of being, physical aliveness, without this emergence of premature thinking. Memorizing and cataloging become dominant. Thinking replaces what could have been being. Thinking function usurps the place of being, right? That is psyche-soma integration, born of continuity of experience and good enough infant care. This type of mental functioning is an encumbrance to the psyche-soma. or to the individual human being's continuity of being, which constitutes self. And we talked about earlier, often he refers to that as true self. So the thinking is happening at a time before there's been psyche-soma integration. So the personhood of the infant has not integrated into personhood, but only into that self that's recording images, but not able to process those images and make sense of them. So the child comes to feel and think that the memorizing and the cataloging is the absolute essential part of their existence, that they cannot have any failures with the memorizing and cataloging because it's a life or death situation. That's the part of themselves that care for themselves. We can see that one of the aims of psychosomatic illness is to draw the psyche from the mind back to the original intimate association with the soma. So coming up with a stomach ache, a headache, some digestion issue, a sleep issue, skin issues. I mean, there's so many of them in which the mind is brought back to the body, and the body demands attention. So to see this symptom as an effort towards the self-cure, an effort towards the soma to cure the neglect. So we're in this place, right, where the relationship is between the mind and the psyche, rather than the integration of the psyche and the soma. Winnicott gives this wonderful example about how to help pregnant women who have, anxiety prior to childbirth and anxiety about whether they're going to be able to care for their infant. And he reports, as opposed to teaching, and the teaching is more of mental instruction, pregnant women, he recommends relaxation methods at their best enable the mother to become body conscious. That is essential, is she is to experience childbirth and the first stage in a natural way. In summary, Winnicott refers to two distinct bases for normal mental function. The first one, and I quote, a conversion of the good enough environment into perfect adapted environment, enabling minimum reactions to impingements and maximum of natural continuous self-development. So this is this growth towards psyche-soma integration. Minimum reactions to impingements. Contrasting with this cataloging of impingements, and he spends a lot of time in the article recording birth trauma examples where there's just exquisite memory of early birth and this memory and cataloging of that experience. So there's this cataloging of impingements for assimilation at later stages of development, when there's more psyche-soma integration and a possibility to understand the impingements and one's reaction to the impingements in a deeper way than just by cataloging them. So there's no person yet there to understand that experience. Prior to this, there's the dyad, the mother child unit. And that is the unit status prior to that hatching of self and the first individuation. Hard for students to understand that piece, that the personhood isn't achieved, that there's a child going through experiences that is not integrated, has not achieved wholeness, is in the mind and the body split. Okay. The Winnicottian notion of the mind is defensive and not integrated into psyche-soma. And as such, this is the way that the thinking usurps being. Often we'll see a child who's smart, who will go into early reading at 3 years old, 4 years old, where they're reading fluently. And here's just a perfect example of a child going to thinking early and not being able to move into play and being in that continuity. And many times parents and professionals will misread the early reading as a success point, rather than as a defensive act. I'd like to now talk about a case of a 17-year-old male obsessional that I worked with. And he grew up as the oldest in a family with a very erratic mother. The father, fortunately, was stable, and he ended up divorcing, and the children lived primarily with the father and just visited the mother periodically. But the early experiences were quite profound and caused major impingements, and he lived in the reaction of those impingements. So the symptom that he presented with was that he would try and memorize long strings of numbers. They might show up on buses or license plates. And then he would try to recollect these long strings of numbers, 10 or 12 numbers in a row, and he couldn't do it. And he would walk around focusing on his mind failures. His mind keeps failing him. It's not remembering right. I can't remember anything anymore. And his whole obsession was that he was losing his mind. It wasn't functioning for him. And we can see from the theory that this is what he was doing from the get-go, memorizing and cataloging. And this became his caretaking. And of course it fails you. There's no way to raise yourself to 17 in the mind's psyche. This is a adolescent who was totally disconnected from his body. Very bad acne, greasy hair, no connection to his body or his hygiene, grooming. It was just a walking head who lived in his head and was fearing that he was going to die because his mind is failing him. This is this emergence of the obsessional, the thinking, the overthinking, the always thinking, the planning, the micro planning, the anticipation of all of the possibilities that might happen. So through this, we have this profound disconnection with the body and with the needs of the body. We could spend a little bit more time talking about this case. I know you both have some interesting personal reflections that you'd like to talk about, do some application. Why don't we take a break for a moment? We'll come back and we'll apply this material more broadly.